This is the story of Dechala, favoured daughter of Slaanesh and the Prince of Pleasure's cruellest champion. In today's saga, she will bend the nation of Cathay to her will, clash with the forces of the Blood God, and answer the age-old question: can heroes explode? My name is Willis, and I've used Total War Warhammer 3 to tell a new tale for Dechala, and today I present it to you. All the battles, conquests, strange dealings, and peculiar bedfellows made along the way. There will be blood, there will be indiscriminate slaughter, and there will be bodily fluids of all varieties. This is my narrative campaign for Dechala, the Denied One. Our story begins in the Far East, where Dechala was slithering through the mountains seeking prey. She descended on some local goblins, and the poor souls could not begin to understand what she had in store for them. Then again, these simple creatures would probably enjoy it. Making her way through the highlands, stirring confusing feelings in goblinkind far and wide, Dechala and her marauders made it to the gateway of Koresh, and her swell of forces burst forth. As her rams pounded at the gate, the Dark Prince's followers were eager to do some pounding of their own. And as the heavy woods splintered and parted, they swarmed over all in their path. Goblins, orcs, even giant spiders, all were swallowed up and dispatched in a fit of lust-filled carnage. The onslaughts of hacking and stabbing, the writhing mass of half-naked bodies, the tingling mix of flesh both pink and green. Despite, or maybe because of, all the murder, everyone was having the time of their lives. But alas, all good things must come to an end, and the remaining orcs, goblins, and trolls were rounded up. Their fates lay in the huge pleasure palace Dechala had planned for this town. You may think a pleasure palace full of snotty goblins and flatulent orcs would be the most off-putting thing on earth. But here's the thing about Slaanesh, the god of pleasure and Decala's patron. The more vile, disgusting, and depraved something is, the more he's into it. With the goblins' moans echoing across the valley, Dechala set her sights north, which was the only real way she could go from here, as the very large landmass to her south appeared to be missing. But north was Grand Cathay, a land waiting to be defiled. And the seeds of corruption had already been planted. Bamboo Crossing was her first major target, and while Dechala and her marauders were having fun with the greenskins, a pleasure cult had been worming its way through the city. As the armies of Slaanesh laid siege, the common folk were eager and waiting for their rapturous release, though the less weak-willed were still wanting to put up a fight. They sallied out from the city, and to Decala's great surprise, the Cathayans displayed both speed and cunning, hitting her scaled behind with their cavalry and crowmen. As they weakened the Chaos Force's flanks, the Cathayan wizards buffeted the marauders with spells. Dechala had a plan to counter this. She found whoever was casting these spells and cut their head off. That's not a figure of speech. I mean, she slithered right up to them and decapitated them. Gruesome stuff, but believe it or not, this is far from the worst fate to befall one of Decala's enemies in today's tale. Having severed the head of the defending forces both metaphorically and physically, Dechala took control of Bamboo Crossing. But before she could get her bearings or have a spot of slap and tickle with the local populace, there came an intriguing sight. Balthazar Gelt, Supreme Patriarch of the Imperial Colleges of Magic, a hero by most accounts, and here he was, roaming around Decala's newly conquered lands, most likely planning to do typical hero things. I'm sure he thought he was being inconspicuous, but as he slowly, nonchalantly drifted ever closer to Decala's newest seat of power, it became increasingly obvious that he was up to something. When he finally revealed his master plan and attacked, I can't say that anyone was all that surprised. Dechala met the arch-alchemist in the field, where he'd positioned his forces atop a tall plateau, aiming to gun down the Slaaneshi forces as they struggled to reach him. Gelt was a smart one, it must be said, for this move also concealed the majority of his forces, so when Dechala and her legions finally got within range, they were greeted with an army far larger than they were expecting. As the marauders labored up the hill, battered by the Imperial firepower and buffeted by Gelt's constant magical attacks, Dechala bounded ahead and scattered the rocket crews. She then turned her sights on the wizard himself, hoping to distract him long enough for her army to scale the slope. She distracted him a bit too thoroughly, however, and as they were locked in an intense duel of steel, magic, and chaotic energies, Balthazar, well, he exploded. Hero swords are not supposed to do that. and both Dechala and Gelt's Imperial entourage were stunned for a moment before the former continued the carnage and the latter ran for their lives, fleeing from the bloody pile of sodden rags that was once their leader. She had also given her new foe a mark of Slaanesh to remember her by. Gods only know where. Spurred by this crushing victory, the Tormentors descended on Fu Hung, taking the castle city with relative ease as the defending forces had run away. A few days later, instilled with some newfound courage, the Imperial army returned to try and retake their city. Why? They thought leaving their fortified position only to return and attack the enemy was a good tactic. I don't know. But Dechala was willing to even the odds and meet them in the field. These were the Empire's finest sons, in a strange land defending all that was good from a menace beyond comprehension. But to Dechala, they were an inconvenience. Barely waiting for her army, she took her favored warriors and plowed into the enemy like a steam tank. And as horns in the distance signaled reinforcements, she met them with similar speed and ferocity. Any sense of discipline evaporated as a bloodlusted Dechala carved through regiment after regiment, becoming a maelstrom of pain and pleasure. Screams were mixed with occasional moans of ecstasy. How a human mind could be twisted so absolutely and spontaneously to find joy in moments of absolute barbarity is a wonder. But such are the ways of Slaanesh. The slaughter was indiscriminate, and most survivors were captured and sent back to the pleasure palaces for initiation. Those that got away brought stories and frantic reports back to Balthazar, who had miraculously recovered from exploding. The lands Dechala had carved out started to reflect her twisted desires. The sounds of rattling chains and mixed groans of pleasure and pain were heard from cities. The land was scoured with corruption and the rivers turned to a slimy, sticky consistency. The true nature of this new liquid? Well, I think that's best left to the imagination. Balthazar, appalled by this rapid defilement of a once green and noble land, brought his forces to bear once more. Though this time, the tables were turned. The Tormentors of Slaanesh had selected their battlefield of choice, choosing the advantage of a steep hill. They used the hill to pick up such tremendous speed, slamming into Balthazar's army with a force and ferocity that shook the earth. It was a bloodbath. Dechala wasn't here for prisoners, and turned the Imperial army into ambiguous piles of gore. Gelt knew he'd made a grave mistake, and ordered a retreat, but Dechala denied him this. She chased him down, determined to see if he was any more robust this time around. Alas, he was not. He exploded again. Makes you wonder, how can you be such a decorated and powerful wizard when you have such a habit of exploding? The arch-alchemist was scattered to the four winds, quite literally, and the bloody haze fell to reveal a new enemy. One who was hell-bent on removing the taint and corruption from his homeland. The Iron Dragon, Zhao Ming.
I know that you already revere me.
Surrounding Zhao Ming were legions of Cathayan warriors, soldiers loyal to him and their homeland, well-trained, highly disciplined, wielding ingenious and destructive weaponry. What's more, he was also surrounded by an aura of smugness and narcissistic entitlement that would be well placed in a champion of Slaanesh. The forces clashed at the Temple of the Elemental Winds, a sight both powerful and symbolic to the native Cathayans. The two sides were evenly matched, with the Iron Dragon certain that his military genius would award him a deserving victory. One thing they don't teach you in Cathayan military academies, however, is how to deal with a 6-armed snake monster hell-bent on defiling your entire army. Decala's shock vanguard dove into the main swell of troops, and her wizards invoked a gargantuan mirror into existence before shattering it, raining infernal glass down on those below. It was an apt representation of the instant fracturing of Zhao Ming's confidence. Despite being quite a large dragon at this point, the instantaneous ruin he had witnessed snapped his psyche, and he began to flee before doubling back, returning to the fray to show this invader that Cathayans were made of tougher stuff. Though evidently they are not, as he was cut down with brutal efficiency by Dechala. His soldiers, upon seeing their all-powerful leader brought low, turned tail and ran. Such slaughter shook the status quo, and the Cathayans sent in the diplomats to push for peace, though they were chained up in one of Decala's pleasure palaces and the war raged on. She pushed onto Hanyu Port, skirting around a pair of alchemist heroes who tried to do something. The act of cutting down an all-powerful immortal dragon had emboldened Dechala, and she decided not to wait for the siege engines to be built, declaring that she could perform the same function. Obviously, no one was foolish enough to disagree with her, and the defenders were almost relieved to see no rams or great siege towers approach, though that relief quickly turned to horror as the chosen daughter of Slaanesh rapidly battered down the door and burst into the city, killing hundreds in the process. The assault was quick, precise, and excessively brutal, though this was just the beginning of the torment for this city, as the chaotic invaders erected another vast debaucherous palace in their patron's name, filled to the brim with the very finest goblin and human pleasure slaves. I know what you're thinking. What a terrible selection. Dechala was well aware of this, and it became the #1 priority that needed fixing, a task that fell upon one of her loyal heralds, Bane-Touch Circlemaster.
Naught else matters but sensation.
She took her forces to eastern Cathay to hunt down the reclusive lizardmen who lived there, figuring that a few giant reptiles would introduce a whole new caliber of degeneracy to the newest pleasure palace.
Pain is another's pleasure.
The lizardmen were decidedly more robust than the humans, and a forward assault on their mighty Saurus warriors would have certainly been repelled. So Bane-Touch exercised rule #1 of Slaaneshi tactics. Hit them in their behind. Rule #1 for Slaaneshi anything, really. The chariots targeted the skink regiments first, sending the smaller lizardmen cascading in their path. And after gashing holes in their defenses, they hit the Saurus ranks. The results weren't nearly as comical, but the impact was very real. Despite their stoic defense, not even these mighty lizard warriors could resist a continued pounding from the rear. And when their lines faltered, the marauders swarmed over and cut them down. The resolve of the lizardmen crumbled, and the Tormentors had a foothold in the far, far east. Similar new ground was being trod in western Cathay, as Decala's forces reached the Warpstone Desert. The cursed dunes are said to twist and mutate any foolish enough to cross them, but that threat sounded like a promise to the invaders, and they proceeded without caution, establishing a base of operations. Their incursion spread to the Cathayan mountains, creeping ever more central. Wherever she went, the taint of Slaanesh soon followed, making the land shudder and twitch like a writhing mass of mutated flesh. Zhao Ming watched the land he loved descend to chaos. The natural beauty of Cathay reduced to an obscene mix of pink goo and fleshy appendages. His forces were exhausted, and he was a shell of the man he was just a few weeks ago. He sent diplomats once more begging for peace and an end to the constant bloodshed. But here's a lesson he and every other Cathayan failed to learn. Dechala does not have a safe word. Spurred by this disgraceful act of diplomacy, Dechala surged forwards in a new wave of cruelty. She found a band of peasants who'd taken up ramshackle arms in a futile attempt to defend their homes. Dechala cared not for their hope. In her eyes, there's no difference between an honor-bound warrior and a lowly grubby peasant. They are all just souls to feed her master's insatiable appetite. She cut them down in Slaanesh's unholy name. Zhao Ming's forces were scattered, his lands conquered, huddled for safety in a dilapidated ogre encampment they'd occupied. It was pathetic. The Dark Prince has a thing for humiliation, you see, and watching the Iron Dragon live like this, alone, dirty and angry, he got more enjoyment out of this than he'd ever get from consuming the dragon's soul. His arrogance in leaving him alive would soon come back to bite him, though again, that's yet another thing Slaanesh kind of likes. For now though, the god of all things sultry was quite pleased. Dechala had humiliated Zhao Ming. Corruption was creeping steadily across the land, and his other servants were making grounds against the lizardmen. Cults were growing steadily in cities all across the world as Norskans, dwarves, Kislevites, elves, all were getting down and doing the dirty in the name of Slaanesh. Corruption was spreading like a cancer across Cathay. Though a large swathe of land in the center resisted, but Decala's forces were tightening around it like a noose, and soon the humans would be gasping for air, if not for a fatal distraction. As battered and broken as his pride, Zhao Ming picked himself up from the filth and depravity of his ogre camp and attacked. He hit Shangyang, and Dechala pivoted her forces to meet the defiant Cathayans, but as quickly as they came, they were gone. Then they hit Shenwu, sacking it of all its spoils. As though they were exchanging battle plans, the Eastern Lizards also adopted a similar hit-and-run tactic. though a tad more mercilessly, burning towns to the ground along with any inhabitants. She turned her full attention to the insolent Cathayans, chasing them down, only for the trail to go cold, the resistance fighters appearing elsewhere. They sure were slippery. And that means a lot coming from a snake. She reconquered Shangyang, only for the insurgents to take it yet again. Decala's howls of frustrations echoed across the mountains and the Warpstone wastes, as she was embroiled in a never-ending game of Whack-a-Cathayan. She played something quite similar at her pleasure palaces. Zhao Ming sacked another town, but this time the Tormentors were hot on his trail and cornered him at the Temple of the Elemental Winds. Fueled by boundless frustration at the Iron Dragon's antics, Dechala stormed towards the Cathayan army like an avalanche, leaving desolation in her trail. Despite taking grievous wounds, the Cathayans managed to slip away, and the survivors led Dechala on yet another wild goose chase. Yet all these attacks, all the repairs and all the extra forces brought to bear to combat this futile resistance, they were crippling the Slaaneshi economy. Like a horsefly biting at a bull, Dechala could not rid herself of this insolent pest, and his tactics were working. To make matters worse, Decala's rage deepened as her oldest servant, Bane-Touch Circle Master, was blessed by Slaanesh, transforming her into a greater demon. You might wonder, why the envy? Dechala was Slaanesh's chosen daughter, one of his greatest champions. Surely another getting the Dark Prince's gifts shouldn't mean much. Well, you'd think so, but jealousy ran through the favourite of Slaanesh as readily as lust. Dechala was denied her ascendancy until she killed her husband, who was in hiding somewhere in the universe. It seemed her fate to search for him until the end of time, the promised gift of demonhood just out of reach. Hence, the denied one. So to see a lesser servant bestowed the greatest of gifts, it boiled her blood and threw her into a rage that only the cruellest of actions could sate. Though perhaps this was all part of Slaanesh's twisted game, for Decala's unbridled ferocity as she caught up with the Iron Dragon was some of the most depraved yet.
So that I may deny you.
She tore his army to shreds, and the earth drank deep as Cathayan blood poured endlessly. Chariots crunched bone, demons rent souls. Dechala was the eye of the storm, screaming, tearing, inflicting agony beyond mortal comprehension. Zhao Ming ran, but she was not finished with him. He begged for mercy, and Dechala took great pleasure in being the denier for once. She followed him to the very ogre camp she'd left him in all those weeks ago, and cursed her hubris for not killing him then. Knowing his doom was here, the Iron Dragon met Dechala head-on. The marauders found the Cathayans in a forest, and a chaotic melee overran the dense vegetation. As the bulk were engaged, Dechala made her furious advance. You'd have thought the heroic act of meeting her in the field meant that Zhao Ming was prepared to face his death head-on. But no, he fled like a coward. Again. His retreat was covered by the reinforcements he'd ordered, which arrived slap bang next to Dechala. They never stood a chance. Sick of his cowardice, the Tormentors chased Zhao Ming down and cornered him. With nowhere to run, they descended on him, only to find that he wasn't there. Will this dragon's craven tricks never cease? She slaughtered what troops she could find until Zhao Ming finally graced her with his presence. She did not wait for any backup. She ploughed into his entourage, intent on finally killing the dragon and feeding his soul to her god. He tried to make a run for it, but Dechala refused him this. She commanded her wizards to summon demons to hold him in place, and with nowhere left to run, Dechala finally did what she'd been dreaming of for weeks. She cut down the Iron Dragon and snuffed out his futile insurgency. With this bother dealt with, Dechala turned her sights back to the Cathayan heartland and the other immortal dragon of the Eastern Empire. Now, it should be noted that while Zhao Ming's guerrilla war was incredibly frustrating and took much of Decala's time, it was not the only notable event during this stage of her conquest. While she was tied up chasing the Iron Dragon across desert and mountain, her cultists had been busy proliferating cults in her name far and wide. Furthermore, she'd sent diplomats to local powers and struck up alliances with Lokir Felheart of the Dark Elves and Zartan the Black of the Dawizar. Don't ask what sort of tricks Slaaneshi diplomats employ to sweeten the deal. I promise you, you don't want to know. She'd even made friends with Kugarth and his Poxmasters of Nurgle. Though this partnership did not come with an invite to the pleasure palaces, diseases spread like wildfire in such a setting as I'm sure you can imagine. Furthermore, the Western Front had made huge progress, and the Lizardmen had been driven to near extinction. The partnership with Lokir was instrumental in all of this. and the positioning meant the Tormentors were able to descend on the supple heartland from both sides. Decala's generals were poised to strike, practically quivering with excitement. And when the time finally came, they unleashed themselves on the Cathayan forces with complete reckless abandon. Though that did not always work in the invaders' favor, with one such assault turning to disaster for the Slaaneshi forces. The eager general, a herald of Slaanesh, rushed their forces forward and met the enemy with eye-watering speed, positioning themselves as the spear tip of this lightning-fast attack. While the damage caused by this assault can't be discounted, it was also sloppy. Chariots were surrounded and dismantled, units were flanked and poorly positioned, and the general cornered and killed. Despite the blunder, the remaining troops held firm. One remaining chariot broke from the melee and hit stray units with brutal tenacity, while the marauders held firm, cutting and whipping and cutting. Despite no lord to lead them, the troops snatched an unexpected victory. A monumental feat, considering their general's embarrassing display in the opening sections. He started too quickly and finished too soon, a textbook case of premature attaculation. While her legions flooded into the heartland, Dechala found a suitable distraction that kept her from the initial invasion. She'd happened upon some elves, a race she had yet to include in her Pleasure Palace menagerie. She tore over the camps, commanding her troops to steer clear of the most weak-willed regiments. She intended to break them and add them to her collection, and she did not want a challenge. As the elves were scattered, she was met with an unlikely and uninvited guest, a demon prince of Khorne. The four Chaos Gods are no fans of each other, but Slaanesh and Khorne, now there's a rivalry for the ages. The two forces met in roars of bloodletting and battle lust, with the Lord of Skulls demons looking clumsy and bloated next to the deadly choreography of Slaanesh's chosen. The demon prince was felled by Decala's blades, and it makes you think, what hope the Cathayans could have against one who dispatches infernal foes with such ease? This is the point where it all seems inevitable. Decala's forces are too powerful, her rage too intense. Yet, in an unlikely twist of fate, the last bastion of order in the land somehow prevails in a heroic, desperate struggle. I am afraid to break it to you. This is not one such tale, and the scouring of Cathay was just as brutal as you might fear. As Decala's allies secured the borders, her legions collapsed on the remains of civilization, and the last remaining dragon, Miao Ying, held on desperately to the scraps of her nation. Nowhere was safe, as gargantuan demons blended into the shadows and ambushed defending reinforcements mercilessly. In one such battle, the Cathayans fielded over 1,000 archers, hoping to halt the chaotic advance in a rain of arrows. They never got the chance, and were slaughtered before they could loose a single volley. As the Tormentors pushed forward like an inevitable tide, a bold stand was made. At the shrine of the alchemist, Miao Ying had sent a contingent of forces wielding weapons of mass destruction. A grumpy old slayer and his human companion, Gotrek and Felix. The blades of these two had cut down 1,000 chaos spawn in their time, but it was too little, too late. They were caught in a whirlwind of bone-crunching chariots and remorseless serpent men, and the fighting was desperate and callous. The Cathayans watched with misplaced hope as the pair of adventurers stood against the ruinous forces. But alas, this is not a story about heroes. Gotrek met his doom, mangled by a Hellflayer chariot, while Felix was mobbed and smothered by a mass of sweaty, aroused Northmen. He always was the romantic one. Decala's forces finished their crossing of the Warpstone Desert, only to find their allies, the Dawi Zar, were going above and beyond and battering down the great gates of Cathay. She sent messengers to coordinate next moves, yet somehow the dealings moved into the realms of wartime real estate, and the Tormentors managed to not only secure vast amounts of gold from her allies, but also their eternal obedience as subjugated servants. Again, you don't want to know what negotiation tricks Slaaneshi diplomats use, but boy are they effective. Decala's forces swept across northern Cathay and swelled outside the last bastion of Miao Ying, the fortress city of Nangao. There was no heroic final stand. No heroes sallied out to defend the city. Any hope had been snuffed out long ago. What remained was inevitable. The forces of chaos smashed down the doors and swarmed through the city. They fell on the defenders, and the city became a ceaseless, echoing din of steel, slaughter, screams, and rapturous ecstasy. Humans were hunted down in the streets for sport. Those that survived long enough were dragged off to pleasure palaces around Cathay. With this overwhelming defeat, any remaining footholds of resistance were crushed, and the once-defiant nation was divided up between Dechala and her underlings. You might think the chosen daughter of Slaanesh and the vessel of jealousy would despise the idea of sharing with a bunch of chaos dwarves, siege mutants, nurglings, and dark elves. But Dechala didn't mind. She found herself in bed with the strangest of fellows, and that's about the most debauched thing she could do. Almost enough to satisfy the Prince of Pleasure. Almost. And that was my narrative campaign for Dechala. If you're hearing this, you listened to the whole thing. What was that? 20, 25 minutes? More? Bloody good job. I'm Willis, and this channel is me exploring how I can turn some of my favorite games into stories both big and small. If you've enjoyed this campaign format, there's a few others floating around, and if you want more Dechala in particular, I've got a shorter piece with her focused entirely on her first quest battle. I will link those in the description. I'll be coming up with these videos every few weeks, so subscribe if you want to stay in the loop. And let me hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Tell me your experiences with Dechala, and if you've got any suggestions or wish lists for other lords you want to see covered, let me hear them. Also, if anyone was bored enough to count all the double entendres as they went, let me know how many you spotted. I can tell you that there are at least 5. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. You've been amazing, and I hope to see you another day